So it's a real pleasure to have all of y'all here and to do like a tolerance experiment. If you were at my last talk, I made the argument that there are three things that we've discovered with comparisons to other animals that make humans really special, that are at least derived features and maybe even unique to our species, one of which is being extremely tolerant. And since we're all packed in here, we'll get to see that hopefully on display while I keep going. All right. So what I want to do today is talk to you about the self-domestication hypothesis. The idea is that cognition can evolve due to selection for friendliness, that when selection actually targets behavior that leads to organisms being pro-social or doing something to benefit another individual. And that as a result of that, you have accidental byproducts that appear that were not selected for. One of those accidental byproducts actually is one of the things we're trying to explain about ourselves, which is cooperative communicative abilities. And it's all mediated, this strange relationship between friendliness and cooperative communication through development. All right. And I'm going to try to argue that not only are dogs self-domesticated, but that many organisms may be candidates for self-domestication. And I'm going to present evidence that one of our two closest living relatives may be self-domesticated as we think dogs are. All right, and in the third lecture, I'm actually going, next Monday, I'm going to take this case to our own species and say, well, gosh, could it be that if this is such a powerful evolutionary force driving animal cognitive evolution, did it play a role in our own species evolution? And I'm going to argue that it did. All right, so you have to show up for next Monday's lecture for that, and my guess is it's going to be a great ABA design because I don't have dog in the talk title next week, so I imagine that there will not be as many people there, but that's okay, I understand. All right, so I have many people that help me make everything happen that I'm going to present today. If you want to learn more, you can go to both of these books, and you can find me at these different places. Hopefully I'll write you back. But in the meantime, I want to tell you about cooperative communication that we've observed in humans, because that's what sort of started this all off. Really, it's an observation of Mike Tomasello and many developmental psychologists working with him, and on the problem of how children develop language capacities. This is one of the earliest abilities that is thought to scaffold cultural cognition, the ability to understand gestural communication. The experimenter is going to hide this little toy in one of two places, and then she's just going to tell the child where it is by gesturing. The idea is that when kids start to understand your communicative intention, your intention to inform them and to work with them in a cooperative manner through communicative gestures, they start down the path to not only acquire language, but to fully participate in human culture. So there are many different measures that have been developed that are nonverbal to look at children around the age of 9 to 12 months as they start to express these abilities. And we went and took many of those same tests and played them with non-humans. I started out playing with chimpanzees and other great apes. So this is Fifi playing a very similar game. We just hide something in one of two locations. This time we're trying to tell her where something is using a novel gesture, this funny little block. And all she has to do is point to where it is. She gets it wrong. And what I can tell you is this is very representative of our closest living relatives. As brilliant as they are, and if you were here last lecture, you saw in a sea of similarity, there is this difference of cooperative communicative ability. As brilliant as they are, they really struggle in this sort of focused domain of social cognition. All right, so very exciting. Let's roll the tape. Let's get the show started, because now we can try to start answering a question: how does cognition evolve? Because if this really is derived in our lineage, this ability to cooperatively communicate as assayed by these nonverbal techniques, well, now is the fun part. Now we get to make up adaptive explanations and think about how these skills that may be so crucial to becoming human have happened. So one idea, it's something to do with our brain size as it increases over human evolution. Maybe it's something to do with how foraging complexity across different species is related to changes in cognitive ability, and maybe that's something to do with human evolution as well. Social intelligence hypothesis, the idea that we have to outcompete, manage information, exploit others. Maybe that's what drove the evolution of these cooperative communicative abilities that are so important to our development. And more recently, the cooperative breeding hypothesis, the idea that we are best characterized, our mating strategy as cooperative breeders. If anybody's had a kid, you won't argue with that idea. And so maybe that's what it is. It's the ability to work together to raise very dependent offspring was something that drove cognitive evolution in our species. So what I'm going to suggest to you today is, and what I myself, when I launched my own career trying to understand the evolution of cooperative communicative abilities in humans, I really thought the answer would be somewhere here. The social intelligence hypothesis, obviously, selection is going to act on the thing that I think is important to being human. I mean, the joke is, if you are busy studying it and you think it's so important you'd spend your life doing it, obviously natural selection thought it was important too. And so it must be that it was selected. And so I was sure that this would be something that natural selection had acted on, and that if you wanted to have a species that was better at cooperative communication, well, selection acted on cooperative communication. All right, so what I'm going to suggest to you is that that may not be the case. And luckily, I just changed this from derived to unique. The difference being if something's derived, it means it's changed in your lineage, but maybe there are other species that have changed in similar ways. But if this cooperative communicative ability is truly unique, we're kind of up a creek without a paddle when it comes to comparisons that might shed light or allow us to infer how this ability evolved in our own species. But what the good news is while I'm going to argue that these hypotheses didn't actually help us too much, it ends up that these abilities, or at least the cooperative communicative abilities that first start to show up in young infants as they begin to learn language, are not unique. Because what we found, and it was a big accident, and we tell the story in the book, it ends up that our dogs are really good at solving many of the same problems that kids begin to solve around 9 to 12 months of age that make them or prepare them for communicating and participating in culture. So it ends up that dogs use cooperative communicative gestures. They do it very flexibly. When we hide something in one of two places and we gesture either by pointing or looking to where it is, and we even run controls where you don't do anything, and it ends up when you run the controls and you play the game again and again and again, and chances 50-50 in these olfactory controls, and we have 10 different types we've done. It ends up dogs are prioritizing visual information. They don't use the olfactory information, and they're guessing, especially when you only give them correct. You only count them as correct when you look at their first choice. I mean, eventually they would smell the food and find it, but if you're just looking at do they go directly to the correct answer, they can't do it. They're a chance. So it ends up that they use these visual gestures, though, spontaneously, and we can give them novel gestures, which is even more impressive, like the one we gave Fifi that she couldn't use and all the other apes that we've tested are unable to do, but kids are really good at. So here's this goofy mutt, and if you're a great ape fan, this is a really depressing video. When we first discovered this, I was surprised as anybody else. Here is this goofy mutt, and we're going to play that same game. We're going to hide food one of two places, and we're just going to tell the dog, here's where it is. But of course, no one's communicated to this dog this way before. Why don't you just hand it to me? So we play this game again and again, and dogs are not only above chance, they're well above chance, and they play these games at the level of success as children. And I'll show you some nice data next. So we went bigger now, and the question was, if this really is something that's special about dogs, what if we test dogs not just on sort of these cooperative communicative tasks, but we actually have a comparison to some non-social tasks. We tested hundreds of dogs and large samples of kids and apes, and we used essentially the same exact methods. And we asked the question essentially, okay, is it that somehow when we do comparisons between these different species, that dogs really are going to come out as looking unusual compared to other great apes? And the answer on the social measures is yes. If you were to ask me, and these are 30-month-old children, if you were going to ask me what organism is most like a 30-month-old child socially, as they're beginning to learn language and their theory of mind is coming online, I would tell you it's actually a dog. Dogs perform most similarly on the cooperative communicative tasks that great apes really, really struggle with. But the next set of data suggests do not ask your dog about your physics homework because they understand almost nothing about the physical world. Things like connectivity or gravity or solid objects passing through one another, they really struggle. Whereas great apes are quite comparable to young human infants at this age. All right, so then this is just raw performance. How many do they get correct or wrong relative to one another? But then we also looked at individual differences. So this is kids and looking at if you do really well on one of these games, does that then predict you do well in another game? Or is it just a whole mishmash and it ends up, even though this is supposed to be a social measure, what you do on the marker test is most correlated with the shape game and understanding shapes. I mean, maybe it is. But if it really is that they're domains of cognition, then you would predict that individual differences would be more related among the social tasks than among the non-social tasks, and vice versa. And that's what you find with kids more or less, is the kids' performance on one social task is related to the other, and physical too. But what happens with the great apes? These tasks are unrelated to one another. It seems like they're just not using something or recruiting across different domains, or maybe they have a domain general approach to these different problems. But when we look at dogs, they actually have a much clearer pattern than even humans across the two domains. It does look like, when you look at the cognitive structure, that dogs are convergent with human infants, even if you're not just looking at overall performance, just individual differences in the pattern therein. All right, so I would suggest that this is sort of surprising and interesting, because I wouldn't blame you if you'd walked in the door and said, well, these two species are, for all intents and purposes, extraordinarily closely related and very similar morphologically, and their brains are very similar. So surely on something so simple as hiding food in some place and somebody just showing you where it is, they'll be more similar to one another than this guy who is so distantly related. And that's not at all what we find in this domain, this very narrow domain of cooperative communication. It looks like these two distant relatives are more like each other than you might have expected based on genetic relations. Okay, so at this point, I actually was still trying. I got very excited, obviously, because I'm thinking, oh my gosh, what if this is a product of evolution? If it is that dogs have these remarkable abilities because they've evolved to interact with us and bond with us, holy cow, if we can figure out how it happened in dogs, it might have relation or relevance to trying to figure out about our own species. But at this point, I actually was still thinking that the answer would be the social intelligence hypothesis, that there was direct selection on cooperative communicative abilities in populations of dogs as they were evolving from wolves, and those dogs that could interact and understand the communicative intentions of humans better would be at an adaptive advantage. They would be selected for, and therefore you'd have cognitive evolution. That's what I thought. I thought, there'd be natural selection. And Dan, in the introduction, told you I was raised by Richard Wrangham, and I remember I was so excited telling Richard this hypothesis one day, and he said, well, right, but how do you know it's not a byproduct? I'm like, what? What do you mean a byproduct? Obviously there was direct selection on my thing. And he's like, no, because you and I have been reading about Dmitry Belayev and his foxes, and I'm about to tell you the findings. And that led him to challenge me to think about the fact that maybe cooperative communication was another byproduct of domestication. So what do I mean by this? Well, Dmitry Belayev was a Russian behavioral geneticist, and in 1959 he started one of the most amazing experiments in the history of the study of behavior, at least, and it still continues today. Every year when fox kits that are bred on the farm are 7 months of age, their students and their staff go in front of the foxes, and they simply just see if the foxes approach, and if they interact in a very friendly or pro-social way, they want to jump in your arms and sort of have a nice interaction with you. And if they do, in the experimental line, they breed foxes who are friendly together. And they've been doing that since 1959. And if you do this, you run away, you try to bite, you're fearful, you do not reproduce. Okay. So no surprise, after 40, 50 years of selection, and in fact they saw results within 4 or 5 generations, you have a population in this experimental line that approaches humans. Now, being great experimentalists, they kept a control line that they originated the exact same generation. They originated the experimental line, and they bred them randomly, and they continue to breed them randomly for how they interact with humans. So they have a control line, they have an experimental line. They've been kept in absolutely identical situations all this time. And so that way you can see what the effects of the experiment are. And no surprise, when you compare the two populations, well, the one that was selected to approach and try to want to be with people, approach people more than the control line. Now is where it gets fun. But they also wag their tails like crazy as they're approaching, and they maintain a puppy level of tail wagging into adulthood. They also bark and cry like fox kits do, but normal control fox adults do not. And they do that at very high levels. They also have a high level of floppy ears. They have the star mutation. They have curly tails. They have piebald coats. They have crowded, smaller teeth. And they have a shortened muzzle. None of these things were selected for. Looking at the underlying physiology, they have much higher levels of serotonin, and they have lower levels of circulating corticosteroids. Their HPA axis has been highly affected. My joke about them is they have 5 times the level of circulating serotonin in their brains, so they are literally born to be on Prozac. These are very, very, very happy foxes. And they don't bite. They absolutely do not bite. And so this fox actually, that's my hand in one of the fox's mouths. It actually was just greeting me, and it was just sort of, like your dog might be excited. It was just nicely mouthing my hand. Okay. It gets more interesting, though, because the control foxes, they breed within 6 weeks. They will mate, breed, and successfully reproduce within a 6-week period every year. The experimental foxes, now it is 6 months. They mate across 6 months, and they successfully reproduce across 14 to 16 weeks. So you have an expansion of reproductive window. And then developmentally, in terms of important behaviors relevant to wanting to interact with humans, relevant to the development of the behaviors that were actually selected, what they show is an expanded window of development. So they show friendly, puppy-like behaviors earlier, and they show them for longer during development relative to the control line. So they have this expanded window of developmental plasticity relative to the control line. All right. So another interesting thing is, well, maybe this is just about foxes. It's not. Hang on, John, I'll stop in just a second. It's not just about the foxes. This type of experiment has been replicated with lots of different species. And while the byproducts of the selection are not uniform, you always, when you select animals for friendliness towards humans, have a major change in the serotonergic system, and you have observation of byproducts. And so these are some of the other species that have been experimentally domesticated, and they seem to correlate with what we see in normal domesticated animals, and people call this effect, these byproducts, the domestication syndrome. John Tooby, yes, sir. That's a great question. So I did say developmental plasticity. So the window where you can socialize them is another way to say this, is wider. And so they have more plasticity in terms of their ability to interact and learn to interact in a friendly manner with humans. Whereas that window is much shorter in the control foxes. Okay. Thank you for the clarification. So I actually got to go to Siberia. Richard sent me there. He had no idea where I was, but that's another topic. And I got to work with the foxes, and it ends up he was right. And here's how he was right, because I played communicative games with the foxes. So I would, for instance, gesture to one of 2 toys. You'd gesture or touch the toy, and it would make a sound. And you would leave the other toy over here alone. You wouldn't touch it. And what we found is that the experimental foxes would touch the toy that you wanted or gestured, the toy that you gestured, touched and played with, they wanted to play with when you actually then gave them the opportunity to make a choice. The control foxes did not. And even more interesting is we did a sort of a non-social version of this. I put a feather on a stick, and I had the feather interact with the toy, and it ends up the control foxes were very interested in interacting with a toy that a feather touched, but the experimental foxes not at all. Okay. So we then replicated, oh, and by the way, these foxes, 0 human socialization. 0. No contact with humans other than being fed every day, fed and watered. Okay. So then we sort of replicated the technique we've used with great apes and dogs, etc. We looked at the fox kits, both populations, and then dog puppies and wolf puppies. This is an example at the Wildlife Science Center in Minnesota where we work with wolves of the technique. So you just point to one of the 2 locations. If you don't use a visual gesture, I told you already, they can't just find it on their own. Here, the wolf actually is successful. It's quite cute. Yay, wolf. I can tell you that that's not what normally happens. Here's the data. So when you compare the experimental fox kits, and these are 2 to 3 month old puppies in all the different species, or kits in the different species. So you can see the experimental foxes are performing like dog puppies. The control foxes are performing similarly to wolves. Okay. So interestingly, we worked for months to socialize this population. So these were just not socialized at all and had the same socialization, as in 0 human socialization. These guys had 0 socialization. These guys we hammered with human socialization. And it was the unfortunate task of a Harvard undergraduate to sit and hug these puppies for weeks on end. And basically I told her, make them love you. Make them like you and not be fearful. And so she worked as hard as she could, and we tested them at different ages, and it really didn't matter. They were not using the cooperative cues that we were giving them. So it seems like you could make the argument that, at least in the case of the foxes, that selection directly on cooperative communicative ability is not necessary, and Richard Wrangle was right, that cooperative communicative abilities are a byproduct of selection for friendliness in this case. The thinking is that, well, dogs and wolves actually have the ability to use gestures and behavioral cues of other individuals. They just don't use ours. And so when you take away the fear and you replace it with a positive motivation to actually want to interact and be friends, now they're going to take the old cognition and they're going to use it with you. All right. So it ends up that cooperative communication is also a crazy result, it seems, of the experiment that was designed to select for friendliness. You get, if you want to have a smarter fox, you make a friendlier fox, which was a surprise if you went into this thinking about the social intelligence hypothesis. All right, which I was. But what could link all these things together? There's one really interesting hypothesis. There are actually several, but this is probably the leading hypothesis that most people are entertaining. It's the neural crest hypothesis. The idea is that the neural tube that develops in the first couple weeks of fetal development has this set or patch of cells called the neural crest that develop, and they develop just between the epidermis and the neural tube, and they're just there for a few days or a week or so. And then once they develop, they kind of explode out into the body. And they migrate all over the body, and they're pluripotent stem cells, and they go off to make lots of different parts of the body. It ends up that they're involved in the origin of the adrenal gland cells, melanocytes, involved in creating melanin, and bone and cartilage cells. And of course, all of these things are implicated, all these types of cells are implicated in the domestication syndrome. Specifically, I think it's going to be interesting as we think about humans. Neural crest cells are very important in facial development and in the development of teeth and eyes. And of course, they go all over the body, and they're involved in everything from cells that are involved in the HP axis to cells involved in teeth and in bone growth in terms of the length of the muzzle, let's say, or face shape. All right. So what I want to propose is, based on this fox work and using the foxes as a model for dog domestication, that dogs are a great example of self-domestication. The story we normally tell is, oh, humans went out and we got some wolves and we were like, wouldn't it be great to make dogs? They're awesome. Let's have dogs, guys. We got tools. Why don't we have dogs too? It'd be great. All right, that's not what happened, because we now know that dogs began evolving at least 14 to 25,000 years ago. The first seed had never been sown. It was hunter-gatherers and foragers who were interacting with wolves that led to the evolution of dogs. So I don't think, and there's some people who might disagree with me, but I don't think that foragers went out and said, I know what we need to do. Let's leave our kids, while we're out foraging with some wolves. They'll take care of them, and we'll bring back food for them. This is going to go great. And we'll do it generation after generation, and we'll create these things called dogs. I don't think that's what happened. Instead, I actually think that there was a major ecological shift as human populations began to live at higher density. I think that humans, as they were doing this, did the thing we do best, which is they create a lot of garbage and waste. And when I mean waste, I mean feces. It ends up, and there's a beautiful new study, it's one of my favorite studies the last few years. Some poor graduate student followed dogs in Zambia around and watched what they ate. And it ends up a quarter of their diet was human feces. And when they analyzed the human feces, it has the crude protein level that is equivalent to chicken. And it has the energy level of the staple carbohydrate diet there called sadza. So what I'm telling you is that human feces, from the perspective of a canid, is digested, cooked, it'll be there, it won't run away, it doesn't kick, and it doesn't bite. It is the wolf energy bar. So if you can sneak in and take advantage of this new ecological niche that's been created, and instead of being fearful, you can be attracted to humans, then you're going to be at a major adaptive advantage. And the thinking is the wolves that made that choice, now there are hundreds of millions of them instead of the few 100,000 that are left of the endangered population of wolves that did not make that choice. So one of the things we've been doing to try to test this idea is we're looking at eastern coyotes. There are now coyotes living in all 48 states, whereas there were no coyotes 50 years ago east of the Mississippi. We just finished a new study, we're writing it up right now, where we looked at whether coyotes will approach a trap camera and use the trap camera as a novel object to look at their fear of human artifacts. And we looked at where they live relative to the population density of humans, where these cameras were placed. And what you find is that where you have high human density, coyotes are much more willing to approach the trap camera, and where there are very few humans, they run away from the trap cameras. This is really a fun picture off of one of the trap cameras. We have many of them. Not only are there white splotches now on the tail ends of coyotes, but there are also white spots on their coats, and we are also seeing a loss of melanin in their eyes. So what I'm suggesting to you is that coyotes that are able to approach humans and take advantage of the resources and waste that we have around our communities are at an adaptive advantage, just like wolves would have been as dogs were evolving. All right, and then lastly, there's actually really nice work showing that there has been positive selection on the neural crest, or genes that are involved in neural crest development in dogs. So all of this is to say it's an active area of research, and there are some testable predictions. I do think that there's an exciting idea to pursue here, that dogs are self-domesticated. Once dogs were self-domesticated, that's not that they would be finished. They would be sort of more like the typical village dog that you might see. And they would be great alarm systems because wolves are highly xenophobic. And what's interesting is because the physical traits are tied to selection for friendliness, as we see in the coyote, people would pick up on this. These are the funny-looking wolves that are less aggressive. It would be very easy for them with their ecological knowledge to know, oh, these aren't the wolves that we compete with. They just come and eat our poop. That's fine. And then they bark. The number one cause of mortality for human hunter-gatherers is intergroup aggression, and there you are at night worrying about is a raiding party coming, and those crazy wolf dog things bark and maybe alert you to people approaching. All right, at least that's a possibility. All right, and then we know that lots of interesting genetic work showing that dogs genetically converge with us as they've lived together in similar ecology. And many of the same genes are actually evolving and been under positive selection, everything from starch digestion to malaria resistance. All right, and even more exciting from a cognitive perspective is the discovery of the oxytocin loop, that there is a interspecific oxytocin loop. So when you make eye contact with your dog, they're not trying to steal your sandwich. They're hugging you with their eyes potentially because it creates oxytocin in you and in the dog as you physically interact as well. There's been very nice measurement of this effect, number one. Number two is that people, the amount of eye contact your dog makes with you, when you ask people about the relationship they have or relationship quality they have with their dog, it almost perfectly predicts. Eye contact predicts relationship quality and vice versa. And of course, that's related to and the mechanism that is helping drive this oxytocin loop. Even more interesting, there's a new paper that's going to be coming out showing that dogs have unique muscles in their eyes that actually help reveal the white sclera. And when we talk about humans, we're talking about the importance of white sclera, but it seems that dogs actually have unique muscles in their eyes that are not in wolves that help them draw back the edges of their eyes so that you can see more white sclera that then gets that oxytocin even more so they can hypnotize you more. What do you mean you don't want to give me that treat? I'll move those muscles. Okay, so whether those are byproducts or they've been directly under selection, we don't know yet, but that's an exciting area to go. To look at. Another important point to make that even for me when it was discovered or revealed, I was surprised and didn't really understand, is that the European breeds that here in the Western world we're most familiar with, they all are no more than 200 years old. They're all the product of the Victorian era. So there were only 8 breeds of dogs for the last 3,000 years. And before 3,000, there would have just been dogs. And they probably would have been like your typical village dog you'd find in a developing country, or a dingo, Australian dingo. Okay, so the argument is, again, that dogs evolved. They had increased fitness via friendliness. It created accidental byproducts, one of which was this cooperative communicative ability. And it was all mechanistically allowed for through development and shifts or expanding windows of development. The neural crest being one of the leading hypotheses people are really excited about entertaining. All right. So what about other species, though? Because this is a great story about dogs. But I think that there's huge implications for this idea. I do not think, and if you understood what I was trying to argue, I do not think that dogs were self-domesticated through intentional artificial selection. I think that it was natural selection. And if natural selection could affect dogs, or wolves, I should say, to create dogs, well, natural selection could affect many organisms in this way. And so we started to look out in the natural world at some really interesting species that might be candidates. Pictures up here of those that are. Hint, it's not the eel, it's the wrasse. But anyway, I could go on about, I'm so excited about wrasse, but I don't have time. All these species are really cool. Your local native animal here, the Channel Island foxes, are an interesting possibility. This is actually a deer in my neighborhood. Just happened to be a white albino deer that came and ate all our azaleas every day for 3 years. I'm like, come on, it's the god of evolution telling me, this must be true. Well, how would it end up in my front yard? But I want to tell you about bonobos as a candidate for self-domestication. So one of our 2 closest relatives, if you're from California, you've heard of them. Probably the rest of the United States has not. And they're equally closely related to us as chimpanzees. And the idea, though, for their evolution, at least using the logic of self-domestication, is that south of the Congo River, where bonobos evolved, female bonobos, for some reason, at some point in the last 1.5 million years, said, you know what, this situation really sucks, and we're going to stop it. And there was really strong sexual selection against male aggression. We think that was aided, or at least the possibility for speciation was aided by the existence of the Congo River. Chimpanzees all live north or east of the Congo River. I guess you could say east, west, north, but none of them live south of the Congo River. And bonobos are the only ape that live south of the Congo River. And so we think that there was selection against aggression, favoring male friendliness, and speciation could occur because gene flow was cut off by the river. So, friendly males were the winners south of the Congo River is what the story is I'm about to tell you. So just like dogs, as a result of selection for friendliness, there are a whole host of byproducts that have arisen, including, relative to chimpanzees, they're pretty good at cooperative communicative tasks. Not relative to humans, but relative to chimpanzees. All right, so I just want to stop here for one moment and just say, just preface this by saying amazing field work coming in with bonobos. We've known so little about bonobos from the wild, but my favorite finding from the wild, just to set this all up, because really, friendliness, could it really win the day? Well, there's a concept called reproductive skew, the idea being that if you look at all the males in a group, for instance, you can say, okay, well, how many offspring on average does the average male have? And so low skew would be, well, every male has the same number of offspring as every other male. There's sort of equality across the males. And high skew means, okay, one male had all the offspring. So you would predict, maybe, that chimpanzees, where you have alpha males, and they can be quite domineering and violent, et cetera, they're going to have really high reproductive skew, because what's the point of being an alpha if not to monopolize all the reproduction? Well, it ends up from 2 field sites now we know that male bonobos have higher reproductive skew than chimpanzees. So the most successful male bonobos are more successful than the most successful chimpanzees at monopolizing matings. But the thinking is, and as I set this up, it's not because they're doing it, it's because they're being chosen. That females with female choice really like the same male. And that friendly male wins the day. All right, so why a candidate for self-domestication? Chimpanzees that everybody knows about, they are famous for all sorts of things, but what they also are incredible at is being quite protective and aggressive of their groups. So males do all these terrible things. They kill each other. They have coalitions to raid territories. They coerce females to do terrible things against their will. Females will attack unrelated immigrants. They're quite aggressive towards them. And their sex lives are, relative to bonobos, pretty boring. Essentially, sexual behavior is essentially for reproductive purposes only. All right. Bonobos, on the other hand, there has never been a bonobo group that had male and female adults in it where an alpha male bonobo has been observed. There's no violence towards neighboring groups. They can have aggressive interactions. I'm not trying to suggest that interactions between all neighboring groups is peaceful, not at all. But no bonobo has ever been observed to kill another bonobo. There's no infanticide. And I can tell you there is definitely no female coercion during mating in any way that resembles what you see in chimpanzees. Unrelated immigrant females are actually the preferred social partner when they enter a group. They're not attacked, and females actually welcome them and would rather hang out with them. Adults show juvenile levels of play and sexual behavior throughout their lives. How do they do it? The argument is that south of the Congo River, where females decided to choose the friendliest males, they were able to exert this power because for some reason there was some ecological trait south of the Congo River that allowed them to form friendships and coalitions against male aggression. Male bonobos are still bigger than female bonobos. So they kind of violate the norm that you think of, is that larger animals are always going to win a contest. Well, sure, as long as it's one-on-one. But if you scream, or more importantly, what we see in bonobos, if your baby screams, well, if there are 8 females now chasing you, great that you're bigger than one of them. So these females form coalitions, it seems, and I would argue not to protect each other, but to protect their infants. And we've argued in a paper that bonobos are neither male or female dominant, they're actually baby dominant. Because the last thing you want to do is piss off a baby bonobo. Because if you do, everyone's coming. And when we did a dominance hierarchy, and we use the same measures for dominance you typically do, and we actually put the babies in the dominance hierarchy, babies were among the top ranked individuals in the group. So I'm not even joking that they're baby dominant. All right. So morphological signs of self-domestication potentially, reduction in teeth, loss of melanin in lips and tail, In adults, adult cranium are more similar to infant cranium than chimpanzees. So basically, the shape of their cranium changes far less during their lives than chimpanzee cranium do. Bonobos have double the serotonergic axon density in their basal and central nucleus of their amygdala. The idea there is that perhaps that allows them to be a little bit more inhibited or less aggressive in certain types of social interactions. Not all, but certain types of social interactions, particularly with strangers, perhaps. So all of that together, Richard Wrangham and I sat down and we thought, well, what would be a model of bonobo self-domestication? And here's the idea. I already told you they got isolated south of the Congo River. Ecological conditions allowed for increase in female gregariousness. And here's the key. The cost of male aggression now is outweighing the benefit. And therefore, you can have selection for prosocial males. Basically, the cost of being aggression became too high. If being super aggressive doesn't allow you to coerce females and get them to do what you want, and doesn't lead to more females coming into your group, well, actually being alpha and aggressive is very costly and time-consuming. And so, therefore, the benefits no longer are there, and there's selection for friendliness. All right. And then, if we're right, development will be a big part of the story. We'll see byproducts, and those byproducts will be related to developmental pathways. All right, so here's some, I don't have time to tell you all the things we tested, unfortunately, but I'll tell you some of the fun ones. There's a whole book about it, and I can point you to the papers in the literature if you're interested. So a couple of, or should say a few predictions we tested related to these two predictions. The first being that bonobos will lack xenophobia. All right, so we just thought, given that there's this selection against male aggression, that bonobos will not have the xenophobic psychology that we see in chimpanzees, that they will not be fearful of strangers. And really, we thought they would just be neutral. I was expecting a null result. I thought that we had many ideas about comparing bonobos to chimpanzees and how we were going to do a direct comparative quantitative comparison. It ended up it wasn't necessary because of this experiment and because of the result. It ends up that bonobos are not only not xenophobic, they're xenophilic. They prefer strangers. They have a preference for strangers over their own group mates when it comes to situations involving food sharing. So let a bonobo into a room full of food. They haven't eaten breakfast. They're very hungry. If you just let them in by themselves, they quickly scarf it all up. But in this situation, we give them the chance to open keys to doors that either will allow them to play with a group mate and feed with a group mate or share with a group mate or a stranger. And what we found is, and I thought it'd be 50-50, or maybe they let their group mates in because they're friends and family, whatever. And it ends up that almost 50% of the time they let in a stranger, and only about 10% they let in a group mate. Now, don't feel too bad for the group mate, because this was one of the fun things about working with animals. You're not in control, and you don't know what they're going to do. So I thought they were going to make their choice. It's done. We've done our measures. We have this perfectly planned, and we're on. We're doing our stats. Very clear. All right. It ends up that what would happen is this guy would go open for the stranger, but the stranger would be like, well, I don't know that guy. And he'd walk over, and open the other door. And in about half of the trials, we had 3 bonobos in there eating the food and squeaking and being very, very happy. So they're very French about how they eat. All right. They'd rather eat together. All right. So less food for everybody, but more fun for everybody. All right. So here's a little infant bonobo playing this game. It's just help you understand what it looked like. Sake, and this is a leke. You can see the key here. She could just eat all the food if she wanted. Again, she hasn't eaten breakfast. They're very hungry in the morning. She opens the door. No violence, no aggression. There was some sex, and you could, woohoo, it's fun. You could argue, oh, well, this is all food for sex, except for when 2 bonobo females are having sex with one another. I'm pretty sure it's not for reproduction. So I think that rules out that as an explanation, at least in those cases. Okay. And I should say sociosexual behavior. All right. What about development? Well, it ends up when we looked at behaviors relative to tolerance, important for friendliness. So sexual behavior, the sociosexual behavior, and dyadic food sharing, so the ability to share food in close proximity to one another. Chimpanzees are actually, obviously, have sexual behavior as adults, And they're really good at sharing food as juveniles and infants. They're actually show bonobo-type sharing or levels of sharing. But when they get older, they get stingier. And what we see is this is present throughout, or it appears earlier and is present throughout the adult lifespan. And so what I'm suggesting to you is you have an expanded window of development for this critical behavior for friendliness in bonobos, much like you see an expanded window of socialization in the foxes. So just quickly, data, just to tell you how robust this is a feeding experiment, and this is sociosexual behavior in bonobo infants that are peer-reared. These are all orphans of the bushmeat trade, unfortunately. So there are no parents or adults influencing their behavior. They're all 2 to 3 years of age, so way before they're going to go through puberty, 10 years before puberty. And you can see they have a pretty high level of sociosexual behavior. And if you're wondering where the chimp data is, so did I. When I got the figure and I wrote back and I said, where's the chimp data? And they wrote back and said, that is the chimp data. There was no sociosexual behavior. It was probably the most boring ethological study of chimpanzees that's ever been done. Okay. And then when it comes to sharing food, this is sharing frequency, and bonobos are sharing at the same rate and at a high rate. You can see here's the 7, there's the 7. Chimps start out at that rate, but they crash, and bonobos keep going. They share at this juvenile rate throughout adulthood. All right, so what about our final prediction, where we predicted that tolerance would be related to bonobos' ability to cooperate and be pro-social, or cooperatively communicate and be pro-social more generally. We did a really fun experiment. This was the work of Victoria Wober. She did her PhD at Harvard with Richard Wrangham, and work we did also together with Peter Ellison and his team. We did the first measures of salivary cortisol and testosterone in non-human great apes, which means that we stuck our hands in a lot of bonobo and chimpanzee mouths to get you the data. I'm not showing you, but at least to be able to show you what the data, the caricature of the data. So what we found is that if you let 2 bonobos or 2 chimpanzees into a room, and we know the relationship of those chimpanzees and bonobos from previous control conditions, that they're probably not going to be able to share the food. In anticipation of going into the room with this individual they're not going to be able to share with, bonobos and chimps have completely opposite physiological responses. Bonobos get, it seems, very stressed out, and they have a big cortisol response, but they have no change in their testosterone level. And chimpanzees have no change in their cortisol level, and this is all male data. Male chimpanzees have a big kick in their testosterone, and it looks like they're priming themselves for competition. Okay, so same exact social context, same sample sizes, same exact behavioral and physiological assays, and you get a completely different response in the 2 species. And basically, what the bonobo males would do is they would run in, they'd be really super stressed, they weren't going to be able to share, and they would hug. And then the chimps, what would happen is one guy would run in, the other guy would just stand in the back and not even go in because there might be a fight, they're not going to get any food anyway. And so, one individual will go in and get all the food and eat it all. All right. So what about cooperation and communication? All right. So I'm not changing my thesis here. Bonobos are as bad as chimpanzees at cooperative communication, where you're cooperating in order to communicate. You're doing both of those things together. You have to combine and understand, oh, your intent of your communication is to cooperate. They're not very good at that. But if you look at the pieces, those 2 pieces separately, well, chimpanzees relative to bonobos don't do as well. Bonobos do better than chimps. So bonobos that are more tolerant and are better able at sharing generally are better at solving novel cooperative problems with more partners. And interestingly, if you look at their use of social cues and gestures, bonobos make gaze follow more readily. They're much more likely to follow a conspecific gaze or a human's gaze. And they also make much more eye contact than chimpanzees. When careful eye track studies have been done, it ends up that chimpanzees tend to stare at the mouth of a person or a conspecific. They don't spend much time looking at the eyes, but bonobos do. Bonobos spend most of their time relative to chimpanzees looking at eyes and not at the mouth. Okay? So this is one of the dangers of using chimpanzees as a model species. I know that a lot of people here may be interested in autism, for instance. Oh, chimpanzees look at the mouth. That might be something that we could use to understand autism because our last common ancestor, et cetera. Well, our equally close relative doesn't do that. So you have to be very careful. All right. So just an example, those of you who were here last time saw this cooperative apparatus. Instead of having 2 food trays where you get, if you pull this tray within reach, everybody gets food. Instead, as evil experimentalists, we move the food into the middle. And so it means that you're going to have to get close and you may have to touch each other. All right. So what we found is when we did this to bonobos who had never played this game before, actually it was their first time in here, and pulling this rope and playing with this cooperative apparatus, the more they did it, the better they got, whereas the more chimpanzees played the game, the less success they had. And then when we repaired them, we saw the same effect. We put them with new partners, and chimpanzees just continually fell apart, and the more we did it, the worse they got, and to the point where they just actually refused to do the experiment anymore. And bonobos, it was no big deal. They could do this with anybody, and it didn't matter that the food was in the same dish. And interestingly, when we looked at the payoffs, it ended up that each trial, it would usually be 3 to 1. So we had one condition where there were 4 apple slices in the middle. And if you looked at the payouts, it would be somebody got 3 and somebody got 1, or maybe somebody got 2 and the other got 2, whatever. But on average, it was 50-50, which was interesting. I don't think they were measuring it out. It was intentional. I'm not suggesting that. But it was an equal payout to the 2 sides. So this is what it looks like. And the important thing, if you're a chimpanzee researcher, this is quite remarkable. When both bonobos reach into, the food is here. I know it's dark, but you'll see both their arms reach here. That's incredible. You'd have to have an absolutely remarkable set of chimpanzees to be able to do that. And for bonobos, this is a piece of cake. Reaching into something together to get food, no problem. No reason to be worried of injury or death. All right. So naive bonobos really outperform expert chimpanzees because if you were here last talk, these are the same chimps that were doing all the amazing things I showed you in terms of understanding how to recruit and negotiate. So we find support for these 3 predictions for bonobo self-domestication. And so we continue to get excited about thinking about bonobos as a candidate for self-domestication. And I think there's more and more evidence that that is the case. These adaptive explanations actually, in trying to understand the origin or sort of how this whole process got started, I don't think they helped. Now, I certainly think that once you have self-domestication in the case of dogs or bonobos, now there's going to be some revealed variation that then can be the target of direct selection. But the question, or I think maybe the way I should say it is, the magic of self-domestication potentially is to create variation that then natural selection could act on directly. And so I think, at least in the case of trying to explain dog evolution and the evolution of their cooperative communicative abilities, and in the case of bonobos, our adaptive explanations don't have the big payout that you might have thought they would. So there's your hypothesis for dog evolution. I think it's relevant to many other species, and boy, I can get excited about all the ones up here. Termites are the craziest story, but I'll save you. It involves cockroaches, but anyway. Next lecture, I'm going to take the case to our own species and use this exact same model to look at especially late human evolution and make the argument that we are the friendliest human that evolved. Of course, it's always relative to what? People are like, what are you talking about? Well, have you met any of the extinct humans? I'm not suggesting they were particularly friendly. I'm just saying we're friendlier. And we are the friendliest human that ever evolved. And that we can see evidence for accidental byproducts, and that cooperative communication, or an increase thereof, is also a result in our own species. So again, resources for more information on things we talked about. And thank you, and I'm looking forward to questions now.
Mice and rats? Oh, I'm sorry. What about mice and rats? Have they self-domesticated?
So the question is, well, you got a mic, so you heard. Thank you. Mice and rats. One of the most exciting publications of the last probably 2 years, there's an experiment where There has been accidental self-domestication of wild mice. It's work where they put a fence around a natural area, and they were sampling and resampling mice over many generations. And it ends up that the mice were getting easier and easier to catch. And they started to notice that some of the mice had white splotches all over them. And then one of their measures for health for this study happened to be craniofacial morphology. And it ends up that they have had shortening of their snouts, crowding of their teeth, and increases in these white spots. And they're easier to catch. So I do think that mice are potentially an example, yes.
So when you just treat a capacity as a black box, it's easy. It's sort of easy to imagine that the black box can be bigger or smaller. Okay, but what accounts for the intricate machinery inside the box and how did that get there is a different question, right? So I look at so getting cooperative communication for free by just nyatinizing or friendlizing or whatever,
Right.
is that leads to the question that it's not self-evident that would be the case, but it is the case, right? So
Right.
then you think why?
Right.
And so I'm thinking that young organisms, the parents are extremely important to them, and monitoring them at high rates and figuring out what they're going to do, figuring out how they're going to direct behavior towards the offspring, so that the whole cooperative communication thing is maybe not so much cooperative communication as offspring mind reading of parent, right? And then
Manipulating of parents.
well, that might be a next stage, but at first you have to have the machinery that says there's a mind there and the mind has intentions and it matters what the intentions are and I should figure those out, right? Or not I should, but the
Right.
thing does figure it out. And so I just, and then if you mirror that, then you get cooperative, right? So if both parties have that and they're directing that towards the other party, then it's cooperative, but it starts out as a asymmetric offspring to parent kind of thing. And I was just wondering what you thought about that way of thinking about.
Yeah, the bonobo work in particular, when we first published that bonobos would share with strangers, I think we probably didn't communicate our ideas very well, and people were placing that work into existing ideas and thinking we were saying things that maybe we weren't. So I'm using that as an example because I think it helps. I just want to tell you how I think about the bonobos. I'm not suggesting, for instance, when bonobos are sharing food with strangers, that they have some kind of other regard where they see that the other individual is suffering and they're having a huge empathic response and they want to fix that and make them feel better. I'm not suggesting that there isn't a functional explanation that isn't completely selfish to explain the preference for strangers. In fact, I would suggest that it is totally selfish, because if there is no cost, or at least the social cost of interacting with a stranger is removed. Obviously, there's a cost of you may get disease transmission, et cetera, but the social cost is gone. Well, I mean, there's huge benefit to expanding your social network, to having new friends, maybe having a new alliance partner, new knowledge, et cetera. So I'm not suggesting, even in the case of the selection in the bonobos, that it wouldn't be very easy to explain as in the selfish benefit of the individual. In terms of the mechanism and the developmental idea, I don't disagree with you at all that let me just back up and say and remind when I sort of said, okay, cooperative communicative abilities in foxes, I'm not suggesting that cooperative communicative abilities arose de novo. I'm suggesting that they already had them and that they were constrained in their ability to use them with humans because they were busy running away. So when you turn running away and biting into I want to be in your arms, now they can use those abilities.
Right. I wasn't so much addressing the idea of altruism or whatever or other regarding. I was just more looking at. So cooperative communication would be for the dog to go make a gesture. Hey, I don't know which. Tell me which. Right.
Right.
And then so then there's a signal, and there's a response, right? And
Sure.
that's cooperative communication. But just I the dog am mind reading you, and you do this weird gesture on one side, and I say, oh, okay, it's there. Okay, so that's not cooperative communication. That's just broadcast communication, right?
I see.
But yeah, so that's all I'm saying is that you get the sort of, and that's a hard thing. That's the hard first thing to get. Cooperate. You just have to duplicate it to get cooperative communication.
Right.
But that the origin of the asymmetric communication is mind reading the parent was just what I was suggesting. Anyway.
Yeah, so there would be another hour talk on mechanistic studies trying to get at what exactly is going on in the mind of the dog to parse between, when they're reading your cue, one of the real low-level hypotheses, not even, I mean, you're giving me a lot, I appreciate that, in terms of what the dog might be doing. One of the low-level hypotheses is just, this is reflexive, or they're interpreting it as an imperative, a command. It's not cooperative or communicative at all. They're obeying in a way, right? The way we normally think about when dogs respond to us. So there have been another number of studies to show that those types of hypotheses don't work. Now, trying to parse between your two alternatives in an animal, that gets trickier. And I can't, off the top of my head right now, I'm not thinking of what would do it.
So let me just smuggle in a last thing, which question I have, which is like orangs seem on the social intelligence
Orangutans?
Yeah, seem much smarter than they ought to be. And so I was wondering if, again, it's the adult-child kind of thing, and whether you could talk about orangs.
So orangutans, that when they have been tested, so for instance, in these cooperation tasks, we have been unable to test gorillas and orangutans. It has nothing to do with anything except for we just don't have enough of them. And we don't have them in a situation where we could test them. My prediction is that orangutans would do quite well, and they would probably surprise us. And I think it's because their last common ancestor, shared with all the other great apes, probably had these abilities. And so yes, there's some flourishes and differences between the different species, but I think orangutans are constrained by their ecology, not their cognitive or motivational abilities in their social faculties.
Yes, I always wondered about interspecies communication and collaboration. The internet is full of videos of cats with chicks or cheetahs with deer and things like that. And these are ad hoc situations. There's no time for evolution in that. How does that happen?
So if you watch those videos very carefully, and it might, I don't know, it might actually help address John's question about the infantilization of behavior, because I certainly am a big fan of that hypothesis. I mean, it's basically what I was trying to argue, is that bonobos are Peter Pan. They shouldn't be Pan Paniscus, they should be Pan Peter. They sort of are the chimpanzees that never grow up, and if you've spent any time with them, it sure feels like that. Like, come on guys, like, grow up. They're like, sorry, we're too busy having fun. But the videos of, and there's books of, animals interacting in these special partnerships between all these animals. And if you look carefully, and I have, there's always a dog or a cat or some other domesticated animal that interacted with that the wild animal. And generally, it was either the wild animal was young when they were introduced to one another, when the wild animal would have been much like in its behavior a domesticated animal, or at least more similar to a domesticated animal. So they're not through puberty, they're not showing their adult behavior. And then those relationships sort of continue. So that would be my strong prediction. I think you would have a very, very hard time finding examples, and this, I'm trying to make a testable, falsifiable prediction here. I think you'd have a hard time finding examples, or at least, I shouldn't say examples, I should say an overwhelming pattern of, because there will be an example. That would be a dumb hypothesis, wouldn't it? Yeah. A wild animal as an adult being put with another species of wild animal, or even with a domesticated animal, and having these wonderful relationships that people love to and get excited about.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You didn't talk much about the piggybacking traits that come along with the domestication syndrome, and I'm wondering if there are explanations, specifically wondering whether the small teeth and short snout reflect reduced cost to cooperation and lower investment in defense.
So sorry, yeah, no, the main hypothesis is those are products of the neural crest migration. So many of the cells that are involved, according to the people who've been arguing this for this hypothesis, Adam Wilkins, Tecumseh Fitch, Richard Wrangham, the cells that create teeth and face are heavily impregnated with neural crest cells early in development. And the argument is, and interestingly enough, if you want to slow neural crest development, guess what you do? You increase serotonin levels, which is what you see in domesticated animals. So the argument is you slow down the migration of these cells, and you end up with altered face shape and tooth shape. Now then natural selection can grab that variation potentially. But in the case of the foxes, the only one thing was selected during the experiment. In the experiments on chickens, it's been replicated with chickens as well, and they select for approaching humans, and you have reduction in cranial capacity, change in pelage color, bone density, all sorts of things change. And none of it was selected for. And they have control populations where they raise identically, and you don't see those changes. Does that help? Okay.
Any other questions? Well, thank you so much.
Thank you all so much.